Hello, my name is Alyssa Rona, and I'm here to talk about eugenics. I'm a senior nursing student, and I'm going to talk about the dark and twisted history of eugenics during and after the Progressive Era. So eugenics definitions are on the screen here for you, but the practice of eugenics is referred to everything from prenatal care for mothers to forced sterilization and euthanasia. Galton divided the practice of eugenics into two types, positive and negative, which we'll get into, both aimed at improving the human race through selective breeding. There were many eugenic ideas prior to Francis Galton, starting with Plato, who suggested that selective mating could produce a guardian class. Spartan children were inspected by a council of elders, the Gerousia, which determined if the child was fit to live or not. In the early years of ancient Rome, a father was obligated by law to immediately kill his child if they were physically disabled. Among the Germanic tribes, people who were cowardly, unwarlike, or stained with abominable vices were put to death, usually by being drowned in swamps. It all started with eugenics in England with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution that came out on the origin of species in 1859. Francis Galton is Darwin's half-cousin, and he wanted to take this theory to a step further and apply it to humans by improving good traits and getting rid of bad ones. In 1883, he gave his research a name, eugenics. This research was supported by many clergymen and wealthy individuals and disciplined at colleges and universities. It met a lot of religious ideals. Even Winston Churchill supported the British Eugenics Society and was honorary vice president. He believed that it could solve the race deterioration and reduce crime and poverty. As an idea of evolution eugenics swept through the United States, Madison Grant, a huge pioneer in the eugenics movement and lawyer, wrote The Passing of the Great Race in 1916. The book was largely ignored early on, but began to be used by advocates for anti-immigration and justification for scientific racism. The Second International Eugenics Congress in New York at the American Museum of Natural History occurred. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, was the honorary president. The president of the museum, Henry Fairfield Osborne, endorsed Madison Grant's book, writing prefaces of the book, which argued for views of good racial stock. Grant's American Eugenics Society was established following the Congress in 1921 by Irving Fisher, Madison Grant, Harry H. Laughlin, Henry Fairfield Osborne, and Frederick Osborne, and Henry Crampton. We'll talk more about a few of them soon. So let's now talk about key areas eugenics had picked up traction. The American Genetic Association was founded in 1903 following Gregor Mendel's theories of inheritance and Charles Darwin's theories of evolution. It encouraged the study of comparative genetics and genomics and to promote the application of genetic and genomic methods to the documentation, conservation, and management of organismal diversity. The government under Theodore Roosevelt created a National Hereditary Commission that was charged to investigate the genetic heritage of the country and to encourage the increase of families of good blood and discourage the vicious elements in the crossbred American civilization, which led to other foundations, such as Race Betterment Foundation in 1906 by John Harvey Kellogg, Irving Fisher, and Charles Davenport. In 1907, Indiana passed the United States' first eugenic policy, sterilization. It was funded by the Carnegie Institution of Washington Station for Experimental Evolution. The Eugenics Record Office opened in 1910 and began collecting research on Americans with bad genes and how alcoholism runs in families. The campaign was founded by the biologist Charles Davenport, and the head director was Harry H. Laughlin. The Panama Pacific International Expo in 1915 showcased eugenics and displayed a man who was to represent the average American male, as seen in the top left. Many thought he looked weak and pudgy. Eugenicists spread to people that this was due to the intermixing of races and how this has weakened traits in Americans. 1916 was when Madison Grant released his novel, The Passing of the Great Race. Madison Grant even received a fan letter from his work from none other than Adolf Hitler. The 1920s resulted in the American Eugenics Society being founded by Irving Fisher, who greatly influenced movements like the Fitter Families campaign in 1928, which competed perfect families like the Smiths, the Joneses, and the Johnsons, all white, all wealthy. The 1920s also harbored Mein Kampf, which discussed how Americans were passing sterilization laws and succeeding in keeping hereditary pure, and how Germany needs to emulate this. Sterilization laws on criminals, low IQ, and feeble-mindedness were now being passed in Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Japan, and Sweden. The Third International Eugenics Congress was held in New York in 1932, where scientist Hermann Joseph Muller stated negatively towards eugenics, saying that eugenics might yet perfect the human race, but only in a society consciously organized for the common good. That it's not necessarily the genes that make the person who they are, but it can be where they grow up. Although Hitler's genocidal tactics and acts caused revulsion in the U.S., Frederick Osborn continued to promote eugenic ideals. In 1940, he was selected by Franklin Roosevelt to chair many committees during this time and earn many distinguished titles even after the war. In 1930, the Catholic Church responded to eugenicist ideology by condemning your sterilization laws in the Casti Connubii. In 1933, persecution of Jews becomes Nazi policy and eventually becomes Nuremberg laws between 1935 and 1936, eventually leading to World War II in 1939. Leaders of the eugenicist movement consisted of the creator of the eugenicist movement, Francis Galton, who died in 1911 before seeing the research performed by Charles Davenport and sterilization laws to continue. Henry Fairfield Osborn was a president of the American Museum of Natural History and held the last two eugenics conferences here in the United States, and emphasized that birth selection over birth control is a better method for better offspring. Frederick Osborn was the huge social philosopher who also advocated for eugenics even after the Holocaust and influenced others to follow, like John D. Rockefeller, Alexander Graham Bell, and John Harvey Kellogg. Madison Grant had a family who signed the Declaration of Independence, and one day he left his house and was surprised that all around him were foreign-speaking immigrants who didn't know who he was or did not care about his family who found the country. A conservative medical doctor, nutritionist, inventor, health activist, anti-masturbation advocate, and businessman, John Harvey Kellogg created the Race Betterment Foundation, as well as invented granola and cornflakes, peanut butter, soy milk, and imitation meats. Irving Fisher, the guy with the mustache who reminds me of the Monopoly Man, was an economist, statistician, inventor, who established the American Eugenics Society and was on many other eugenics committees. Harry H. Laughlin was the superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office until it closed in 1939 and was the most active in influencing policy, especially compulsory sterilization. Margaret Sanger was an American birth control activist, sex educator, writer, and nurse whom established organizations that evolved into Planned Parenthood. She spoke to many to bolster her cause by linking it to eugenics. A lot of people were skeptical about birth control and abortion, but she thought that it was better the race to better the race and to get rid of issues such as feeble-mindedness. It was more digestible by the public to connect it to eugenics. Henry Goddard studied feeble-mindedness and scored them based on low-level moron or high-level moron. It was believed that by many eugenicists based on Goddard's rankings that feeble-mindedness is genetically linked, and if you got rid of it, you could get rid of all problems. And this trickled into mainstream society. Even W.E.B. Du Bois was a eugenicist and believed that individuals should breed for brains and beauty, and not all African Americans were talented. To combat prejudice, blacks should try to better themselves. Now, there were a few individuals who were major opponents, including sociologist Lester Frank Ward, author G.K. Chesterton, fly scientist Herman Joseph Mueller, who found that genealogy does not always determine your fate, but your environment may, and the Catholic Church with Pope Pius XI. Now, a few strategies about the eugenicist movement included wealth and power, advocating for a superior race, and using the government to fund its endeavors. In the alpha and beta tests for the Army Examiner for World War I, more than half of individuals were rated as moron under Henry Goddard's scale. This spiked a trend in creating national intelligence tests to be implemented in schools and workplaces. Being feeble-minded was considered a fear. This lends new weight to keep hierarchies established. The eugenicists tried their best to hide behind a slogan of better babies and healthy families, when really they were trying to keep the poor poor and the wealthy wealthy. Removing the possibilities for others to reproduce was a sure way to keep social order in their eyes. Directions over time. So in terms, eugenics was really associated with genetic determinism, or the belief that human character is entirely or in the majority caused by genes, unaffected by education or living conditions. The system believed that any undesirable traits could just be bred out, like criminality, cleft palate, bipolar disorder, alcoholism, blacks, and Jews. Now, this is under negative eugenics, while positive eugenics wanted to increase reproduction among desired traits. With this came forced pregnancies and arranged marriages. And this is another example of ways people believe they could keep their lineage pure. Here's where Charles Davenport went awry. He was sure that the environment doesn't make you feeble-minded, criminal, or insane, it's the genes, and we have to remove the possibility of passing those on, which led to compulsory sterilization laws. Some other forms of negative eugenics is interracial marriage restrictions, forced abortions, which Margaret Sanger advocated for access for abortions for low-income women, and mass genocide. So, reactions from the people. In the United States, Harry Laughlin was awarded an honorary degree by the University of Heidelberg for his work in science of racial cleansing. Compulsory sterilization in Germany made the U.S. newspapers, and by the 1940s, it was associated with Nazism and poor science. 1939, the Carnegie Institute concluded that the ERO's research did not have any scientific merit and withdrew funding, and the office was actually forced to close. On the global scale, Germany passed a bunch of sterilization laws and ended up sterilizing many people. And these laws were really closely based on Harry H. Laughlin's model. Peru involuntarily sterilized 2,000 people between 1990 and 2000, and China continued to have a one-child policy up until 2015. Now, the movement results. Indiana was the first state to enact sterilization laws in the United States in 1907, and by 1914, 12 states had passed laws. Harry H. Laughlin drafted the Model Eugenical Sterilization Law, a model act for compulsory sterilization of the feeble-minded, insane, criminals, epileptics, alcoholics, blind persons, deaf persons, deformed persons, and indigent persons. An additional 18 states passed laws based on this model in 1924. After researching all these 50 states today, 25 have kept compulsory sterilization laws, or kept it with implications as vague as long as it's in the patient's best interest. Hawaii went as far as paying women $200 on plantations for anyone who is current or a past drug abuser to be voluntarily sterilized in what was called the Project Prevention. North Carolina started handing out $50,000 compensation to those who were sterilized by the Eugenics Board of North Carolina, but never got rid of the law. 8 states overturned their laws with some implications, such as long as there's given consent, it's needed for life or to preserve the physical or mental health of a mentally retarded person. So some of the successes included using politics, such as Teddy Roosevelt Immigration, they use immigration as a way to fuel their cause. Sterilization, they would successfully sterilize many people. And global politics, it caught wave by many other countries. And a shift in goals and advances in technology. Eugenics now has changed a lot, since now we are able to determine that, in fact, the environment has a lot to do with causing criminality, and some things that don't follow always through the genes, and that we are able to actually manipulate genes before people are born or even while people are alive. So, Davenport actually received a nod from Teddy Roosevelt for his work. And some of the failures is how this is so challenging, because what actually makes a person feeble-minded? The first person ordered sterilized in Virginia was Carrie Buck. She was raped by a family member and gave birth to a child. Because her foster parents could not handle her anymore at 17, and she gave birth out of wedlock, she was labeled a moron and put into a home for feeble-minded right when Virginia allowed sterilizations. She was ordered to be sterilized on the grounds that she was a probable potential parent of a social inadequate offspring. A lawsuit began, and Harry H. Laughlin, who never met her, endorsed her for sterilization, calling the family the shiftless, ignorant, and worthless class of antisocial whites of the South. The state had won, but the case was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1927, the case was upheld by Harry H. Laughlin's laws, and 5 months later, Carrie was sterilized. And this wasn't the end of wrongdoings of sterilization. A woman named Anne Cooper Hewitt was sterilized after undergoing an appendectomy. The nurse asked her a series of questions that would test her if she was feeble-minded. Anne answered with, "This is ridiculous. Why are you asking these questions?" And the nurse rated her a low-grade moron, and she was sterilized by her mother to gain the heir. When she sued, she had lost the case. Henry Goddard regretted his studies on feeble-mindedness, as he said that the people who were medically termed morons could have easily managed their own affairs. Carnegie had found no scientific basis and closed the doors on Charles Davenport's work in 1939, finding that they only did research on families who had a lot of bad genes or families who had a lot of alcoholism. Everything came crashing down quickly, but a resurgence for eugenics has come through today with advancing technologies. So, social change theories that came through, collective behavioral theory is noticeable. As a surge of immigrants came through, there was a lot of strain or breakdown among those who felt like their heritage was being muddled with other races and wanted to blame the world's problems on something. With symbolic interactionism, the wealthy and elite wanted to hold onto this norm and pass this along using eugenics and pseudoscience as fuel. I noticed in relative deprivation theory in Madison Grant as he walked outside and was upset that no one knew who he was. He was deprived of what was simpler times. Mass society carried two theories, either existing with structure and institutions like the Eugenics Record Office, or different committees which didn't do well because there were too many groups. Much like there are too many Democratic candidates right now, it can be hard to follow a movement if there are too many societies and groups. The other piece to the theory included isolation from social and political institutions, which is probably how the Germans felt after World War I. Adolf Hitler may have found eugenic ideas as a way to voice opinions and find a belonging. Resource mobilization and political process theory was present in ways the eugenicists used power through politics and presidencies to make progress. A few different assets helped mobilize the movement, including their funding for their pseudoscience, the curiosity and commitment from individuals, and the use of foundations, societies, and the ERO. New eugenics advocates enhancing human characteristics and capacities through the use of reproductive technology and human genetic engineering. Those who advocate new eugenics generally think selecting or altering embryos should be left to the preferences of the parents rather than the state, like categorizing positive eugenics and negative eugenics. New eugenics describe themselves as separate from old eugenics, being coercive and being about government control instead of about being non-coercive eugenics and about parental control. Some of these practices included in eugenics are pre-implantation diagnosis and embryo selection, selective breeding, human enhancement through the use of genetic technology such as embryo engineering or gene therapy, and some view these advances as playing God. But in some ways, we have found ways to potentially remove genetic diseases. For example, CRISPR has found a way to modify genes while someone is still alive without having to take the body part out that's causing the disease and change the gene and then put it back inside the person. This is a huge step for us, as it is not removing people's rights, removing someone else's ability to reproduce, and will hopefully help future generations. We still have a long way to go to protect the vulnerable and those under sterilization laws. 1/3 of inmates between 2005 and 2013 in a prison in California were sterilized without their knowledge. Another ethical dilemma regarding gene modification is removing a culture of society who has grown to accept those with genetic disability or diseases. If we remove deafness in children, for example, would deaf culture die? And if a mother has the option of removing a disability in her child but chooses not to, would that cause strife between her and her child when he or she grows up and finds out? So these are just kind of some of the ideas to think about. Here are my references. And then here are some questions. So why do you think the ideas and beliefs of eugenics spread so quickly in North America? If eugenics was discovered in another time, say today, would it have been more or less successful? Why do you think captains of industry, John D. Rockefeller, Alexander Graham Bell, John Harvey Kellogg, helped found the Race Betterment Foundation? What eugenic notes did you find from the clip of Django Unchained? How did this shape slavery in America? Do you think it is ethical for the government to remove the right of reproduction for individuals such as criminals, drug addicts, and individuals who cannot care for more children? Thanks. I hope you guys liked my presentation, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks.